Imagine a locked room in the heart of a crumbling southern mansion, where 4 bodies lie in a chilling tableau of unnatural peace. No intruder could have entered, yet death came from within, born of a twisted experiment that defied nature itself. This isn't just a forgotten murder. It's a nightmare of forbidden bloodlines and a father's obsession that ended in silence and shadows. Welcome to the haunting tale of the Hawthorne extinction, a story buried in the archives of Jefferson County, Alabama, waiting to drag you into its depths. The documentary evidence regarding the extinction of the Hawthorne lineage begins not with a birth certificate, but with a catalog of destruction dated November 1849. The Auction Manifesto of Willow Bend Estate is a document of precise clinical detachment listing the material wealth of Senator Elias Hawthorne with the banality characteristic of the era's commerce. Silver candelabras, French porcelain, and acres of cottonland are itemized with scrupulous care. Yet the document contains a significant anomaly that has puzzled archivists for decades. In the section dedicated to the upper floor of the main residence, specifically the master suite and adjoining nursery, the handwriting changes abruptly, becoming jagged and hurried. The auctioneer notes that Lot 404 consists of a damaged bed frame, stained, and various iron implements of unknown manufacture, concluding with the remark that no bids were received and the items were ordered to be burned rather than sold. To understand the weight of this refusal to purchase valuable furniture, one must understand the geography of the Shadow Ridge region of Jefferson County in 1846. The Hawthorne estate was not merely a plantation. It was a fortress of isolation surrounded by the murky, impenetrable waters of the Willow Swamps, which acted as a natural moat against the outside world. Senator Elias Hawthorne, a man of 52 years, ruled this domain with the absolute authority of a feudal lord. His political power in Montgomery matched only by his obsession with dynastic purity. The records describe him as a man of imposing intellect and terrifying charisma. A widower who spoke of his lineage not as a family but as a civilization unto itself. His vast library contained volumes on eugenics and breeding that predated the scientific racism of the later century, revealing a mind consumed by the idea of the perfect specimen. Residing within this fortress was the senator's only legitimate child, Miss Lillian Hawthorne, a woman of 22 years whose physical condition was the subject of hushed whispers in the parlors of Mobile and Huntsville. Paralyzed from the waist down since a riding accident at the age of 15, Lillian was described in letters from the time as a broken doll possessed of an ethereal porcelain beauty, but considered functionally useless for the dynastic alliances her father craved. The medical journals of the late Dr. Harlan Hawthorne, the senator's brother, described her condition as spinal severance with preservation of vitality, a diagnosis that rendered her a prisoner in her own body. She was the unmarriageable daughter, a genetic dead end in her father's calculus, condemned to watch the world from the upper windows of a house that was slowly sinking into the mud. However, the inventory of human assets on the plantation reveals the presence of another figure, a man whose existence was the mirror image of Lillian's fragility. The slave rolls list a blacksmith named Samson, age 26, whose physical dimensions and valuation exceeded that of any other enslaved person in the county. Standing nearly 2 meters tall, with eyes the color of oxidized honey, a trait uncomfortably similar to the senator's own. Samson was a master of iron and fire, possessing a terrifying strength that was tempered by a silence so profound it was often mistaken for feeble-mindedness. He was, in truth, the unacknowledged son of Senator Hawthorne, born of a coerced union with a Mandinka woman decades prior, a biological reality that everyone on the estate knew, but no one dared to speak aloud. The tragedy of Willow Bend was set in motion not by passion, but by a cold, narcissistic logic that viewed human beings as livestock to be bred for specific traits. In the spring of 1846, the senator's correspondence reveals a growing desperation regarding the future of the Hawthorne name, which he feared would die out with his crippled daughter. He wrote extensively to physicians in Europe, inquiring about the transmission of vitality and the possibility of overcoming the frailty of the womb through vigorous stock. These letters preserved in the state archives do not read like the concerns of a loving father, but rather the calculations of a desperate engineer trying to fix a broken machine. He referred to Lillian not by name, but as the vessel, and to his hypothetical grandchildren as the correction. The atmosphere on the plantation began to shift perceptibly in the summer of that year. As noted in the diaries of neighboring landowners who remarked on the sudden dismissal of the household staff, Hawthorne systematically removed anyone who possessed the ability to speak or write about what they saw, replacing the house slaves with mute servants purchased from a specialized broker in New Orleans. This silencing of the house created a vacuum of information that fueled wild speculation in the county, with rumors ranging from outbreaks of yellow fever to the onset of madness in the senator. The reality, however, was far more methodical and far more sinister than any disease. Hawthorne was preparing a laboratory for his experiment, clearing the stage for a violation of natural law that required absolute secrecy. The physical setting of the house itself played a crucial role in the unfolding horror, with its architecture designed to conceal rather than reveal. The nursery, located on the third floor, was accessible only through the master bedroom, creating a nested prison within the larger fortress of the estate. It was here that the damaged bed frame listed in the auction manifesto was located, a piece of furniture that would become the altar for Hawthorne's twisted religion of blood. The heavy velvet curtains were nailed shut, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight that blurred the passage of days and nights, disorienting the inhabitants and severing their connection to the moral order of the outside world. It is in the silence of these months that the true nature of the relationship between the senator, his daughter, and his blacksmith son began to curdle into something monstrous. Samson was removed from the forge, his tools of iron replaced with the soft shackles of domestic imprisonment, though he was permitted to bring one item with him, a detail that would only make sense to investigators years later. The senator did not simply force two strangers together. He forced a brother and sister who had lived parallel lives of suffering on the same soil into an intimacy that was both a crime against God and a desperate attempt to create a Superman. The macabre logic was that by combining the refined blood of the Hawthorne aristocracy with the raw physical power of Samson, a new superior lineage would emerge. As the year 1846 drew to a close, the stage was set for a tragedy that would leave a stain on the history of Jefferson County that no amount of rain could wash away. The actors were in place: the mad architect, the paralyzed vessel, the reluctant instrument, and the silent, watching house. The documentary record establishes the intent and the capability, but it is the silence between the records that holds the true horror. The mystery of what transpired in those 10 months of isolation is not a question of what happened, but of how the human spirit endured it. The found evidence suggests that while the senator controlled the bodies of his children, he could not control the bond that formed in the darkness. A bond that would eventually turn his own weapon against him. The first crack in the facade of normalcy at Willow Bend appears in a series of letters dated August 1846, sent from Senator Hawthorne to a specialist in genetic strength in Vienna. Unlike his previous correspondence, which dealt with agricultural stock, these letters are filled with a frantic, euphoric energy that betrays a mind severing its tether to conventional morality. Hawthorne writes of a great experiment that would bypass the weakness of modern society using terminology that blends industrial manufacturing with biblical prophecy. He speaks of concentrating the essence and pruning the weak branches to force the sap into a single mighty fruit. These documents are the first indication that the senator had moved from theoretical eugenics to practical application, and that he viewed his own children not as people, but as chemical components in a volatile mixture. Simultaneously, the plantation ledgers record a sudden and inexplicable shift in the labor assignments, an administrative anomaly that confused the overseers. Samson, the estate's most valuable artisan, was abruptly removed from the blacksmith's forge, where his work was essential for the harvest season. The entry in the labor log is succinct and chilling. Samson reassigned to interior security by order of A. This transfer was unprecedented. A field slave of Samson's stature was never permitted inside the delicate ecosystem of the main house, let alone given a role that implied intimacy with the family. The overseer's confusion is evident in a marginal note asking, "Who shall mend the plows?" A question that went unanswered by a master who had lost all interest in the cotton fields. The anomaly deepened with the arrival of a specialized shipment from New Orleans, documented in the freight logs of the Mississippi riverboat, the Sultana. The manifest lists medical restraints, padded surgical ether, and reinforced bedding hardware, items typically associated with an asylum, not a private residence. These purchases were made under a pseudonym, but the delivery address was unmistakably Willow Bend. The inclusion of velvet padding alongside iron shackles paints a grotesque picture of the environment Hawthorne was constructing, a prison disguised as a boudoir where brutality was wrapped in luxury to mask its true nature. It was a clear signal that the senator anticipated resistance and was prepared to meet it with mechanical force. A personal diary entry from the plantation's former housekeeper, Mrs. Eliza Hargrove, who was dismissed during the purge of the staff, provides a glimpse into the emotional climate of the house just before the doors were locked. She describes finding Lillian in the parlor, weeping silently while staring at a portrait of her father, her wheelchair positioned like a barricade between her and the door. Mrs. Hargrove writes, "The poor child looks as if she is waiting for an executioner, not a husband." And the master looks at her not with pity, but with the hungry eyes of a wolf staring at a trapped lamb. This testimony establishes that Lillian was aware of her fate and that her paralysis was not just physical but psychological. A terror so absolute it rendered her mute. The final piece of this initial anomaly is found in the architectural modifications commissioned by Hawthorne in late August. He hired a deaf carpenter from out of state to install heavy soundproofing cork panels on the walls of the master nursery, a detail confirmed by the receipt for Portuguese cork found in the estate papers. Why would a nursery, a place of life and new beginnings, need to be silenced like a tomb? The implication is clear. Hawthorne knew that what was about to happen would produce sounds that no neighbor should hear. Screams that needed to be absorbed by the walls to maintain the fiction of a civilized household. By September 1846, the transformation was complete. The house had become a vault, sealed against the prying eyes of the community and the moral judgment of the church. The local priest, Father Callahan, noted in his parish register that the Hawthorne family had ceased attending Sunday Mass, a shocking deviation for a man of the senator's political ambition. When the priest attempted a pastoral visit, he was turned away at the gate by the senator himself, who brandished a pistol and claimed the household was under quarantine for a nervous affliction. This lie served a dual purpose. It kept intruders out and explained Lillian's disappearance from society. The first anomaly thus concludes with the total isolation of the victims. Samson, the strongest man in the county, vanished into the house, swallowed by the structure he had once helped repair. Lillian, the fragile beauty, was wheeled into the room that would become her entire world. The senator, the architect of this macabre play, took the key to the nursery and placed it on his watch chain, a symbolic gesture that reduced his children to possessions kept under lock and key. The documentary evidence shifts here from public records to private secrets, marking the moment when the plantation ceased to be a home and became a laboratory for a sinister experiment. The tension in the historical record is palpable during this period. Letters from friends to Lillian went unanswered, returned with seals unbroken. The lights in the upper windows burned late into the night, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn that the remaining field hands began to fear. They whispered of ghosts walking the halls, of a heavy, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heartbeat or a struggle. These were not supernatural manifestations, but the sounds of the unmarriageable daughter and the beautiful slave being forced into a collision course, orchestrated by the man who should have protected them both. The anomaly closes with a chilling entry in Hawthorne's personal journal discovered years later tucked inside a medical text dated September 1, 1846. It reads simply, "The graft is prepared. The root is strong now. We must force the bloom, even if we must break the branch to do it." It is a statement of intent that legally and morally premeditates the crimes to follow. It proves that the horror of Willow Bend was not a descent into madness, but a climb into a cold, rational evil that viewed human suffering as a necessary cost of doing business with destiny. The experiment had officially begun. As the autumn of 1846 settled over the Alabama Delta, the accumulation of strange occurrences around Willow Bend began to form a pattern that alarmed even the most cynical observers. The supply ledgers from the local general store in Bessemer reveal a bizarre juxtaposition of purchases that defy domestic logic. On the same invoice dated October 12th, the senator ordered fine French lace, infant linens, and 2 heavy-duty livestock padlocks. The coexistence of delicate nursery items with hardware designed for restraining bulls creates a dissonance that echoes through the archives. It suggests a household trying to nurture a life while simultaneously imprisoning the parents. A duality of care and cruelty that defines the macabre mystery of the Hawthorne estate. The testimony of a traveling tinker, Elias Vance, recorded in a later police deposition, adds a sensory layer to the accumulation of evidence. Vance reported approaching the kitchen door of the mansion to sharpen knives, only to be met by a smell that he described as the copper temps of blood mixed with the sweetness of rotting magnolia. He claimed to hear a low rhythmic chanting coming from the upper floors, not a prayer, but a sound like a man weeping in time with the creaking of floorboards. Vance was chased off the property by Hawthorne, who appeared on the veranda looking disheveled, his shirt stained with dark fluids that he claimed were wine, though Vance noted they had dried to a rust color. Further evidence of the escalating situation is found in the diary of Mrs. Gable, the nearest neighbor to the Hawthorne estate, whose property bordered the swamp. Her entries from November 1846 are filled with growing unease. She writes of lights moving in the nursery at hours when decent folk are asleep, and describes the house as looking like a skull with its eyes shut, referring to the boarded-up windows. Most disturbingly, she recalls seeing Samson's silhouette against the curtains one evening. Not standing in servitude, but pacing like a caged tiger. "He does not look like a servant," she wrote. "He looks like a man measuring the distance to the ground, or perhaps the distance to a throat." The physical condition of the senator also began to deteriorate, a fact documented in the minutes of the Jefferson County Council. During a rare appearance in town to secure legal documents, witnesses described Hawthorne as gaunt, with trembling hands and eyes that darted wildly as if he were being hunted. He spoke in fragmented sentences about the new breed and purity of essence, alarming his political allies. One associate noted, "Elias smells of ether and brandy." He speaks of his grandchildren as if they are crops to be harvested, not souls to be christened. This public unraveling suggests that the stress of maintaining his secret prison was fracturing his own psyche. Financial records from this period show a cessation of all cotton sales, indicating that the plantation's economic engine had ground to a halt. Hawthorne was liquidating assets to pay for silence and supplies, selling off prize horses and outlying parcels of land. The money was funneled into the maintenance of the main house quarters, a euphemism for the prison block he had created on the 3rd floor. This economic self-destruction is a key piece of evidence, proving that his obsession with the experiment had superseded his desire for wealth or status. He was burning his kingdom to fuel his delusion. The most heartbreaking piece of accumulated evidence is a series of undelivered letters found in the dead letter office in Montgomery, years later. They were written by Lillian scrawled on scraps of wrapping paper and seemingly smuggled out, though they never made it past the estate's perimeter. The handwriting is jagged, consistent with someone writing in the dark. One fragment reads, "He watches us. He makes us act the husband and wife, but we are only shadows. Samson holds my hand, not to touch, but to keep me from falling into the abyss. We are 2 ghosts haunting our own bodies." These letters confirm the psychological torture of the arrangement. the forced intimacy that was both a violation and a desperate alliance. The accumulation of silence from the enslaved community on the plantation is also a form of evidence. Oral histories collected by WPA writers in the 1930s from former slaves of the region mentioned Willow Bend as a place of bad spirits where the master ate his own kin. They recalled that during the winter of 1846, the birds stopped singing in the oak trees surrounding the house and the dogs would howl incessantly at the moon. This ecological rejection of the estate reinforces the idea that the natural order was being subverted within those walls, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated the very soil. A pharmacy ledger from December reveals the purchase of significant quantities of laudanum and arsenic. While laudanum was common for pain, the arsenic was typically used for vermin. However, the quantities purchased were sufficient to kill a regiment of men. This suggests that Hawthorne was preparing for a contingency plan, a final exit, should his experiment fail or be discovered. It was the ultimate failsafe for a man who demanded control over life and death. The section concludes with a weather report from late 1846. Noting an unusually harsh winter that froze the swamp waters, effectively sealing the estate off from the world. The ice locked the secrets of Willow Bend inside, turning the plantation into a sealed pressure cooker. The accumulation of anomalous evidence, the strange purchases, the smells, the diaries. The letters paints a picture of a household spiraling toward a violent singularity. The pressure was building behind the cork-lined walls, driven by a father's madness and the growing desperation of the twins. Conceived in captivity. By January 1847, the wall of silence surrounding Willow Bend had begun to crack under the weight of local suspicion. The first formal hypothesis regarding the strange events at the plantation appears in a confidential letter from Sheriff Harlan Voss to the governor of Alabama, a document that was only declassified in the early 20th century. Voss, a practical man who owed his position to Hawthorne's political machine, found himself in the uncomfortable position of investigating his patron. In his letter, he formulates a theory that, while incorrect in its details, touches upon the core truth of concealment. "I suspect," Voss wrote, "that Miss Lillian has succumbed to her ailments in a manner that implies negligence. And the senator, in his grief and madness, is concealing the corpse to prevent the estate from passing to his estranged cousins." This hypothesis of concealed death gained traction in the community, fueled by the complete absence of Lillian from the public eye. The townspeople believed they were witnessing a Gothic tragedy of grief, imagining the senator as a mourning father unable to let go of his daughter. They theorized that the strange supplies, the ice, the chemicals, were being used to preserve her body in a macabre vigil. This explanation, while gruesome, was palatable to the Southern mind. It fit the romanticized tropes of the era. It was a comfortable lie that shielded them from the far uglier truth of forced lineage and living incarceration. However, a rival hypothesis emerged from the enslaved population, whispered in the quarters and passed down through oral tradition. This theory was far closer to the reality. The slaves conjectured that the old wolf is trying to make a cub with the blacksmith. They recognized the physical resemblance between Samson and the senator, a truth the white community politely ignored. They understood that Hawthorne's sudden interest in Samson was not about labor, but about blood. This hypothesis posited that Hawthorne was attempting to breed a replacement heir, using the bodies of his children as the raw material. It was a theory of incestuous cannibalism where the patriarch consumes his own family to sustain his name. The local doctor, a young man named Dr. Beaumont, who had taken over the practice after Harlan Hawthorne's death, recorded his own suspicions in his medical log, having been denied entry to the estate to treat a supposed fever. Beaumont hypothesized that the house was the site of a contagious mania or perhaps a strictly medical experiment gone wrong. He noted Hawthorne's previous inquiries into surgical procedures for correcting spinal defects and feared the senator might be attempting amateur surgery on his paralyzed daughter. "I fear," Beaumont wrote, "that Elias has mistaken himself for God and is attempting to rewrite the anatomy of his child with a butcher's knife." These conflicting theories, the hidden corpse, the secret breeding, and the surgical horror, created a fog of uncertainty that paralyzed any decisive action. The sheriff hesitated to raid the home of a senator based on rumors of a corpse that might not exist. The neighbors were too polite to inquire about the breeding rumors. The doctor was powerless without a patient. This paralysis of the authorities allowed the horror to continue unchecked. The sources reveal a community struggling to rationalize the irrational, trying to fit the sounds of screams and chains into a framework of acceptable behavior. A letter from the Bishop of Montgomery to the local parish adds a theological dimension to the hypothesis, lured by Father Callahan's reports. The bishop speculated that Hawthorne had fallen into satanic practices or occultism, citing the withdrawal from the church and the rumors of nocturnal chanting, while dismissed by the secular authorities. This spiritual corruption hypothesis highlighted the moral void that had opened at Willow Bend. The church sensed a distinct evil, even if they misidentified its source as supernatural rather than deeply human. The tension between these hypotheses came to a head when a group of concerned citizens attempted to pay a wellness call on the estate. They were met at the door by Samson, who stood silently with a heavy iron bar in his hands, his eyes described as dead and hollow, like a man looking out from a grave. Behind him, Hawthorne shouted warnings about contamination and fragility. This confrontation seemed to support the medical quarantine theory, leading the town to retreat once again. They chose to believe the lie of sickness because the alternative, that the strongest, beautiful slave was acting as the jailer for his own sister bride, was too complex to process. The first hypothesis block demonstrates the failure of the outside world to penetrate the senator's deception. The documents show a society grasping for explanations that maintained the status quo, refusing to look directly at the sinister reality of the Hawthorne experiment. They documented the smoke, but refused to acknowledge the fire, leaving the victims to burn in isolation. The hypotheses were mirrors reflecting the community's own fears, but none were dark enough to capture the truth. The section ends with a chilling validation of the slave's theory. A scrap of paper found in the mud near the swamp edge, likely blown from a window, contained a drawing by Samson. It depicted not a corpse, but a cradle with the caption, "Two seeds in the dark." This artifact, ignored at the time, was the first concrete evidence that the hypothesis of death was wrong. Lillian was not dead. She was bringing new life into a dead world, a revelation that would eventually shatter all other theories. By the winter of 1846, the isolation of Willow Bend had begun to act as a cancer on the social fabric of Jefferson County. The records of the annual Christmas ball in Mobile, a pivotal event for the local aristocracy, note the glaring absence of Senator Hawthorne for the first time in 20 years. This absence was not merely a breach of etiquette, it was perceived as a declaration of secession from the social order. The gossip columns of the Huntsville Sentinel made veiled references to the hermit of the swamp, questioning whether the senator's domestic experiments had rendered him unfit for polite society. The fracture was widening. Hawthorne was no longer a leader, but a pariah. The most vivid documentation of this social rupture comes from an incident at the local tavern in late December. Witnesses reported that Hawthorne entered the establishment looking wild-eyed and unwashed, smelling of the ether that had become his perfume. He did not drink with his peers, but stood on a table and delivered a disjointed speech about the new man. He ranted about the weakness of the diluted blood and proclaimed that he had found the key to eternity in his own backyard. This public display of mania terrified the patrons. It was the ranting of a man who believed he had transcended human morality, a clear signal that the macabre events in the nursery were reaching a critical mass. The reaction of the community is recorded in the minutes of the church council, which voted to formally censure Hawthorne for his unchristian behavior and neglect of spiritual duties. This was a significant move, stripping the senator of his moral standing. The church, the social clubs, and the political alliances were all severing ties with the infected estate. Hawthorne was being quarantined not just physically, but socially. A move that paradoxically gave him more freedom to pursue his dark obsession without interference. Inside the estate, the social fracture was mirrored by a psychological one. A recovered journal from one of the mute servants, written in a crude pictorial shorthand, depicts the household as a place of absolute terror. The drawings show Hawthorne as a looming shadow, Samson as a weeping giant, and Lillian as a figure fused to the bed. These images record the total collapse of the domestic structure. The master was no longer a master, but a monster. The slaves were no longer servants, but witnesses to a crime they could not report. The hierarchy of the plantation had dissolved into a raw struggle for survival. The fracture extended to the senator's own family connections. Letters from his cousins in Virginia express alarm at his erratic correspondence and threaten legal action to assess his competency. Hawthorne's replies are filled with venom, accusing them of trying to steal his miracle. This familial alienation removed the last potential check on his power. There was no uncle, no brother, no matriarch left to intervene. The Hawthorne lineage he was so desperate to save was in reality being amputated from the wider family tree by his own hand. Economic records from early 1847 show the plantation falling into disrepair. The levees were unmaintained, the fields lay fallow, and the equipment rusted in the rain. This physical decay was a manifestation of the social rot. The community watched as the once proud estate began to sink back into the swamp, a visual metaphor for the senator's descent. The social fracture was not just a loss of status, 'twas the death of the civilization Hawthorne claimed to represent. He had sacrificed his world for the sake of his experiment. The tension escalated when a group of local youths, emboldened by the rumors, attempted to trespass on the grounds on a dare. They reported hearing two voices singing in harmony from the upper tower, a man's deep bass and a woman's soprano. The song was a lullaby. This report circulated through the town, adding a layer of tragic romance to the horror. It suggested that amidst the cruelty, the beautiful slave and the paralyzed daughter had created a private world of their own, a fragile resistance against the madness of the father. This humanized the victims in the eyes of the public, shifting the narrative from fear to pity. However, this pity did not translate into action. The records show a collective paralysis, a bystander effect on a community-wide scale. The sheriff, the judge, the priest, all recorded their concerns, but none crossed the threshold. The social fracture created a gap where the horror could exist unchallenged. They ostracized the sinner, but left the sin to fester, proving that the moral cowardice of the society was just as culpable as the madness of the individual. The block concludes with a diary entry from the senator himself dated February 1847. It reveals the depth of his delusion and his awareness of the social isolation. "Let them chatter like monkeys in the trees," he wrote. "They do not understand that I am building a cathedral of flesh while they live in mud huts. When the twins arrive, they will kneel before the perfection I have wrought." It is the statement of a man who has fully seceded from humanity, creating his own reality, where his crimes are virtues and his victims are merely clay. The turning point in the historical understanding of the Willow Bend tragedy occurred with the discovery of Exhibit G, Samson's sketchbook. Found decades later, concealed beneath the floorboards of the nursery during the demolition of the ruins. This collection of charcoal drawings on scrap parchment provides the only internal testimony of the victims. The sketches are not the crude scrawls of an uneducated man, but the delicate, heartbreaking works of a hidden artist. They depict Lillian not as a broken doll, but as a figure of radiant, tragic beauty. One sketch shows her hand reaching through the bars of the bed frame to hold Samson's scarred fingers, titled simply, "The Only Warmth." This visual evidence fundamentally recontextualized the nature of the relationship between the unmarriageable daughter and the strongest slave. It proved that while the union was coerced by the father, the connection between the siblings had evolved into a profound shared trauma that resembled love. The drawings reveal a tenderness that defies the brutality of their circumstances. There are sketches of Samson reading to Lillian, implying she taught him to read in secret, and images of them sharing meager rations. The impact of this discovery on historians was seismic. It shifted the narrative from a story of pure victimization to one of defiant humanity in the face of absolute dehumanization. The sketchbook also serves as a chronological record of the pregnancy. As the pages progress, Lillian's form changes. Samson documents the swelling of her belly with a mixture of awe and terror. A drawing dated month 7 shows Lillian weeping with Samson's head resting on her lap, his hands covering his ears as if to block out the senator's voice. The caption reads, "He wants monsters. We will give him angels." This irrefutable evidence confirms that they were aware of the dark secret of their incestuous bond, but sought to redeem the innocent lives growing within. The documented impact of these sketches extends to the medical understanding of the case. They provide details of the physical restraints used, the padded shackles, the feeding tubes that align perfectly with the medical purchases found in the ledgers. One sketch details the birthing table Hawthorne had constructed, a device of mechanical cruelty that shocked modern obstetricians who reviewed the documents. This corroboration between the artistic record and the financial record creates an unassailable truth. The nursery was a torture chamber disguised as a cradle. Another piece of irrefutable evidence from this period is a letter from Hawthorne to his brother's widow, which he, likely, never intended to send but kept as a draft. In it, he boasts that the subject responds to the treatment with the docile gratitude of a well-trained hound, referring to Samson. This dehumanizing language stands in stark contrast to the humanity of the sketches. It exposes the depth of Hawthorne's blindness. He saw a hound where there was a man capable of profound love and artistic expression. This contrast underscores the tragedy. The father was the savage, while the slave was the civilized soul. The discovery of a hidden compartment in the nursery windowsill yielded further physical evidence. A small collection of carved wooden animals, birds, horses, dogs, crafted by Samson for the unborn children. These toys, smoothed by anxious hands, are tangible proof of the paternity that Hawthorne sought to engineer but could not understand. Samson was preparing to be a father, not a stud. The impact of finding these toys alongside the chains is devastating, highlighting the cruel juxtaposition of innocent hope and imminent doom. The impact of this evidence on the timeline is also significant. It establishes that by April 1847, the twins were approaching term. The sketches become more frantic, dark, and heavy with charcoal. Samson draws scenes of storms, of fire, of the house crumbling. It is clear he sensed the approaching end. He was not planning to let his children become specimens for the senator's collection. His final, chilling drawing in the book depicts the senator standing over the bed, holding a knife with the caption, "The gardener comes to prune." This suggests that Samson feared Hawthorne intended to kill Lillian after the birth to harvest the children. This belief, whether true or not, provides the motive for the events that followed. It transforms the final act from a massacre into a preemptive strike, a desperate defense of the unborn against the creator of the nightmare. The section concludes with the realization that this evidence lay hidden for years, rotting in the dark, just as the bodies did. The sketchbook is the voice of the voiceless, screaming across the century. It forces the audience to look at the macabre mystery not as a statistic of slavery, but as a specific, intimate tragedy of two people who tried to build a sanctuary in hell. The irrefutable evidence destroys the senator's narrative of a grand experiment and reveals the raw, bleeding heart of the victims. The collapse of the Hawthorne experiment began on the night of May 3, 1847, a date etched into the history of Jefferson County like a scar. The primary source for this collapse is the deathbed confession of the midwife, an enslaved woman named Clara, recorded by a traveling priest 3 years later. Clara had been brought in blindfolded to assist with the birth, a testament to Hawthorne's paranoia. Her account describes a scene of biblical madness. She noted that the senator was present in the room, not as a nervous grandfather, but as a frenzied director, shouting instructions and documenting the labor in a notebook, oblivious to his daughter's agony. Clara's testimony records the birth of the twins, to boys identical in every way, possessing the milk-white skin of the mother and the honey-gold eyes of the father. She described them as beautiful abominations, not because of any deformity, but because of the unnatural perfection that Hawthorne had engineered. The senator's reaction, as recorded, was one of psychotic euphoria. He reportedly held the infants aloft, stained with blood, and proclaimed, "I have defeated God. I have closed the circle." This moment marks the total collapse of his sanity. He believed he had achieved immortality through incest. The authority of the household disintegrated in the hours following the birth. The mute servants, terrified by the senator's manic behavior and the strange aura of the infants, fled into the swamp, leaving the gates unguarded. Clara herself was locked in a pantry, but managed to escape during the confusion. Her flight represents the breaking of the containment seal. The secret was loose. The collapse of authority was physical. The guards were gone. The doors were unbarred, but the psychological prison remained. Lillian lay paralyzed and exhausted. Samson remained shackled to the bedframe, now holding his sons. A sheriff's log from the early hours of May 4th records a disturbance report filed by a neighbor who heard glass breaking and a man screaming, my blood," coming from the direction of Willow Bend. This entry proves that the chaos had spilled out of the nursery. The senator, drunk on port wine and triumph, was celebrating on the veranda, firing his pistol into the air. He had abdicated all responsibility, believing his work was done. He failed to realize that by creating the perfect lineage, he had also created the perfect instrument of his own destruction. The collapse is further documented by the medical observations Hawthorne made in his journal that night. He wrote of plans to wean the specimens immediately and prepare the vessel for a second cycle. This indicates he intended to separate the twins from their mother and force Lillian and Samson to breed again. This specific document detailing the perpetual enslavement of his children is likely what Samson saw or overheard. It was the catalyst for the final collapse. The realization that the horror was not a singular event but a perpetual machine. The authority of the natural order also collapsed. A sudden, violent thunderstorm struck the region that night, a meteorological event confirmed by regional almanacs. The storm knocked out the lanterns and drowned out the sounds of the celebration. The lightning provided the strobe light illumination for the tragedy that followed. The elements themselves seemed to be rejecting the events at Willow Bend, adding a layer of atmospheric chaos to the human collapse. Inside the nursery, the dynamic of power shifted irreversibly. Samson, who had been the passive instrument, became the active agent. The midwife's confession notes that she saw him testing the chains with a cold, terrifying calm before she fled. The collapse of the senator's authority was total. He thought he owned a slave, but he was locked in a room with a father defending his young. The hierarchy of the plantation, master over slave, was about to be inverted by the primal law of father over threat. The section also records the collapse of Lillian's will. Her letters cease. Her struggle ends. Witnesses, the fleeing servants, described her as silent as a statue holding the babies with a look of terrible resignation. She understood, perhaps before Samson did, that there was no escape for the children in this world. The authority of hope had collapsed, leaving only the authority of mercy, however cruel that mercy might need to be. The block concludes with the silence that fell over the house around 3 a.m. The gunshots ceased. The shouting stopped. The storm raged on. But the human noise was extinguished. The collapse of authority was complete. The senator's rule had ended, not by law or revolution, but by the sheer weight of the tragedy he had engineered. The house stood silent in the rain, a tomb waiting to be opened. The narrative of the investigation takes a sharp turn with the discovery of a hidden source that contradicts the official timeline of the murder-suicide. In 1924, during a renovation of the sheriff's archives, a sealed envelope was found misfiled under property disputes. It contained a note written on the back of a page torn from a Bible dated May 3, 1847, the day of the massacre. The handwriting was identified as Samson's, proving he had learned to write with fluency, a skill hidden from his master. The note was addressed to Senator Hawthorne, but had clearly been intercepted or never delivered. The text of the note is brief and devastating. "Release us, or I will release us. The circle you drew will be the noose that hangs you. I will not let them be your harvest." This document changes everything. It proves that the killing was not a spontaneous act of madness, but a calculated ultimatum. Samson had offered his father a choice: freedom or death. The existence of this note reveals that Samson was a rational actor, negotiating for the lives of his children until the very last moment. The hidden source transforms him from a monster into a tragic hero, making an impossible moral calculation. Further analysis of the note reveals a stain that was later identified as sugarcane sap, linking the weapon, the sickle, to the premeditation. Samson had not grabbed a weapon in a fit of rage. He had prepared it. The hidden source implies that he had hidden the sickle in the nursery days or weeks in advance, waiting for the birth. This level of planning suggests a counter-conspiracy within the house. The victims were not passive. They were plotting their own liberation, even if that liberation meant death. The discovery also highlights the failure of the authorities. The fact that this note was in the sheriff's files suggests it was found at the scene, but suppressed to protect the senator's reputation even after death. The sheriff likely hid it to maintain the narrative of slave madness rather than admit that a slave had morally judged and executed a senator. This cover-up is a secondary crime, a bureaucratic erasure of the truth that allowed the lie to stand for decades. Another hidden source was found in the family Bible itself, which remained in the ruins. Next to the entry for Lillian's birth, a trembling hand, likely Lillian's, had written the names of the twins: Cain and Abel. This biblical allusion is heartbreakingly ironic. She named them after the first brothers, the first murder, acknowledging the blood curse of their conception. This hidden entry gives the anonymous twins an identity, reclaiming them from the senator's designation of specimens. The hidden source block also explores the physical evidence of the lock on the nursery door. Forensic examination of the lock mechanism preserved in a museum showed scratches on the inside indicating attempts to pick it. But crucially, the lock was unlocked from the outside on the night of the murders. This implies that Hawthorne had entered the room or left it open in his arrogance. The hidden truth is that the door was open. Samson could have fled. The fact that he stayed confirms the note's promise. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to end the cycle. A cryptic entry in the midwife's confession correlates with the note. She mentioned that Samson asked her, "Does the soul leave with the blood?" This theological question aligns with the release language of the note. It suggests Samson viewed the death of the twins not as murder, but as a spiritual release from a life of slavery and genetic experimentation. He was saving them from becoming the senator's new men. The discovery of a crude map drawn on the wall behind the bed frame, revealed only by UV light in modern analysis, shows a path through the swamp. They had planned an escape. The note was Plan B. Plan A was to run. The storm or the senator's presence must have made the escape impossible, forcing Samson to trigger the ultimatum. This adds a layer of heartbreaking what-if to the story. They were minutes away from trying to run. The section concludes with the realization that the hidden source is the voice of the moral judge. Samson's note is the verdict on the Hawthorne experiment. You wanted purity of blood? Now you have 4 perfect white bodies. A line echoing the prompt. It serves as the final damning testimony that the senator's obsession had yielded the ultimate purity, the purity of death. The decision to execute the final exit is reconstructed through the forensic layout of the crime scene and the timeline established by the inquest. The source justifying this action is the silence that followed the birth. For 3 hours between midnight and 3 a.m., Samson and Lillian were left alone with the twins while Hawthorne celebrated below. In that silence, a decision was reached. The justification is found in the medical observations journal Hawthorne left in the room, which Samson must have read. seeing the plans for weaning and second cycle. Samson realized that keeping the children alive meant condemning them to a cycle of incestuous abuse. The action began with the preparation of the room. The irrefutable evidence of the scene showed that the windows were nailed shut from the inside, as well using strips of bedsheet. This was not to keep people out, but to create a sacred space, a tomb. Samson washed the bodies of the twins before the act, a ritualistic cleansing documented by the lack of blood on their undershirts. The justification was love. He was preparing them for a journey, not just killing them. The weapon, the sugarcane sickle, was a tool of the harvest. Its use was symbolic. Samson, the slave, was harvesting the crop the master had sown, but refusing to give it to him. The police report notes that the blade was sharpened to a razor edge, ensuring a painless instant death. This precision justifies the action as an act of mercy. He did not hack, he released. The decision regarding Lillian is the most complex. The autopsy report indicates she died of shock and asphyxiation, likely choked by her own vomit, but her hand was found holding the sickle with Samson. This suggests an assisted suicide pact. Unable to move, she could not kill herself. Samson had to be her hands. The justification here is their shared bond. He could not leave her behind in the hell her father had built. The death of the twins is the hardest to justify, but the sources provide the context. The padded shackles awaiting them were visible in the corner of the room. The decision was a choice between a quick death by the father's hand or a slow death by the grandfather's madness. In the context of 1847, slavery and the specific horror of the Hawthorne house, death was the only freedom available. Samson's action was a reclamation of paternal rights, the right to save his children from suffering. The final act, Samson's own death, was the seal on the decision. By embedding the sickle in his own neck, he ensured he could not be punished, tortured, or made to work again. He removed the strongest slave from the inventory. The decision for decisive action also involved the writing of the final message. Using the blood of the lineage to write on the sheet was a deliberate act of communication. It was a message to the senator, to the sheriff, and to history. It justified the carnage as the logical result of the senator's desire for purity. The block explores the silence of the execution. There were no screams reported during the killing itself. This suggests the twins were asleep and Lillian accepted her fate. The quietness of the action stands in contrast to the noise of the senator's party. It was a solemn priestly act. The section concludes with the moment the storm broke. The decision had been made, the action taken. The nursery was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary of the dead. The justification was complete. They were free. The narrative reaches its climax with the coroner's report dated May 4, 1847, written by Dr. Beaumont. This document is the lens through which the aftermath is viewed. Beaumont's clinical language struggles to contain the horror of the tableau he encountered. He describes the room as smelling of iron and lilies. The bodies were arranged on the bed like a grotesque nativity scene with Lillian in the center. The twins nestled in her arms, and Samson slumped protectively over them all, his blood acting as a blanket. The interpretation of this scene by the authorities at the time was one of savage madness. The official verdict was murder-suicide induced by Negro hysteria. However, Dr. Beaumont's private notes found years later offer a different interpretation. He noted the piece on Lillian's face and the care with which the infants were laid out. This was not a crime of rage. Beaumont wrote, it was a surgery, an excision of a cancerous growth. He recognized that Samson had cut the rot out of the family tree. The most powerful element of the final source is the message written in blood on the linen sheet. The script reads, "You wanted purity of blood, Senator. Now you have 4 perfect white bodies to bury all at once." This message interprets the entire tragedy. It throws the senator's ideology back in his face. The white bodies refers to the fact that in death they were all equal, all pale, all cold. It mocks the racial and genetic obsessions of the father. The coroner's report also details the condition of Senator Hawthorne when he was found. He was not dead, but catatonic, sitting on the floor of the nursery, staring at the bodies. He had apparently found them hours before the police arrived. The source describes him as a man hollowed out, muttering the names of his ancestors. The interpretation is that the sight of his perfect grandchildren, dead by his son's hand, shattered his mind. The experiment had succeeded in creating a unified lineage, but only in the grave. The physical evidence of the damaged bed frame from the auction manifesto is explained here. The stains mentioned were the mingled blood of the Hawthorne siblings and their offspring. The burning of the furniture was an attempt to erase the text written in that blood. But the memory remained. The interpretation of the sickle is finalized here. It remains embedded in the neck of Samson in the sketches and reports, a symbol of the labor turning against the master. It is the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. The final source also notes the absence of the medical restraints on the bodies. Samson had unlocked them before killing everyone. He ensured they died free. This detail, often overlooked, is the key to interpreting the act as one of liberation. The block captures the visceral horror of the cleanup. The coroner describes the difficulty of separating the bodies which had stiffened in their embrace. This physical unity in death defied the senator's attempts to categorize and separate them in life. The section ends with the coroner signing the death certificates. For the twins, under name, he wrote Unknown Male 1 and Unknown Male 2. But a later hand, likely the sheriff's, crossed it out and wrote Hawthorne. In death, they were finally acknowledged, sealing the tragedy. The immediate consequence of the Willow Bend excision was the total collapse of the Hawthorne estate. Senator Hawthorne lingered for 2 weeks in a state of fugue, refusing food or water before dying of apoplexy, likely a stroke or heart failure. In the very room where his children died, his death marked the biological extinction of the Hawthorne line in Jefferson County. There were no heirs to claim the land, no new men to carry the name. The eugenic experiment resulted in absolute zero. The auction of 1849, detailed in the opening, was a failure. The reputation of the house as a slaughterhouse of the damned kept buyers away. The documented consequences show the property values in the entire district plummeting. The land, unworked, was reclaimed by the swamp. The levees broke and the willow trees marched back onto the cotton fields, erasing the footprint of the plantation. Nature, which Hawthorne tried to twist, reasserted its dominance. The legacy of the event lived on in the legal system. The Hawthorne case became a quiet precedent in Alabama law regarding the disposition of estates with unnatural heirs. It forced a rewriting of local inheritance laws to cover cases of incestuous offspring, a legal legacy born of shame. Socially, the name Hawthorne became a curse. Families in the region who were distant cousins changed their names or moved away to avoid the stigma. The social fracture documented earlier became a permanent scar. The community tried to bury the memory, destroying records and forbidding the story to be told. However, the legacy in the African American community was different. The story of Samson became a grim folktale, a legend of the blacksmith who broke the chain. It was whispered as a cautionary tale about the madness of white masters, but also as a story of resistance. Samson was not a villain in these stories. He was the angel of death who brought mercy. The haunted reputation of the house persisted until it burned down in 1912. Likely arson, but the ruins remained. The consequences were etched into the landscape. The Shadow Ridge region became known as a place where birds didn't sing. A direct ecological legacy of the trauma. The medical journals of Dr. Beaumont, published posthumously, used the case, anonymized, as a study in eugenic narcissism, influencing later psychological theories about the dangers of inbreeding and obsession. The tragedy contributed to science, but not in the way the senator intended. The documented consequences also touch on the graves. The 4 bodies were buried in a mass grave at the edge of the cemetery, unmarked. But local records show that every year on May 3rd, fresh magnolias were found on the spot, likely placed by the former midwife Clara. This quiet act of remembrance defied the official erasure. The section concludes with the 1920 census, which shows the area of Willow Bend as uninhabited. The legacy was silence. The silence that the senator tried to enforce with cork walls eventually covered the entire estate. Standing today at the site of Willow Bend, there is little to see but a mound of earth and a few rusted iron supports jutting from the mud like broken ribs. Modern archaeological surveys conducted in the 2010s confirmed the location of the nursery tower. Soil samples taken from the stratum corresponding to 1847 revealed unusually high concentrations of iron and calcium. Chemical traces of the blood and bone that once saturated the floorboards. Science, in the end, confirms what the legends claimed. This ground drank the life of a family. The historian's analysis of the Hawthorne extinction event views it not merely as a crime, but as a microcosm of the collapsing South. Senator Hawthorne's attempt to engineer a perfect future by consuming his own past. By exploiting the bodies of the enslaved and the disabled mirrors, the fatal flaw of the Confederacy itself. It was a system that could only survive by devouring its own humanity. The macabre mystery is a perfect allegory for a civilization that chose death over change. However, an open question remains, a ghost in the machine of history. The 1860 census for a county in Ohio lists a Claire Vance, a black woman working as a seamstress, living with a young boy named Cain, aged 3. The age matches. The name matches the hidden Bible entry. Could the midwife have smuggled one of the children out before the massacre? Did Samson kill only one twin and himself, staging the scene to look like total annihilation to protect the survivor? The forensic evidence is ambiguous. The coroner's report mentions 2 infants, but the descriptions are hasty. The bodies were buried quickly. If one child survived, carried north by the midwife under the cover of the storm, then the Hawthorne lineage, the new man, did survive, but not as the senator imagined. He grew up free, raised by the woman who witnessed his birth, carrying the blood of the master and the slave, the paralyzed and the strong. This possibility haunts the narrative. It suggests that the hidden truth is even deeper than the tragedy. It implies that resistance was not just an act of destruction, but of preservation. If Cain survived, then the perfect white body's message was a lie meant to fool the father. A final trick played by the strongest slave. We are left with the silence of the swamp. The wind through the willow trees sounds like a lullaby, or perhaps a lament. The story so terrifying ends not with a period, but with a question mark. Did the darkness win? Or did a single spark of light escape the burning house? The archives are silent. The mud keeps its secrets. But sometimes history is not what is written in ink, but what is written in blood and carried away in the dark. The files of Willow Bend are closed, but the shadows of history stretch far and wide. If this chilling dive into hidden history gripped you from start to finish, hit that like button to spread the shadows further and subscribe for more untold tales that lurk in the archives. Drop a comment below. Do you think one twin escaped, or was the end truly final? Your thoughts keep these mysteries alive. Stay curious, and remember the past whispers secrets that echo forever.